Why do I have to carry this alone? Gave the old ox a handful of month-old growth. Poor quality, he said. Impossible. Bring this here, move that there, on and on. Poor quality, he said. Impossible.
Keep your heart warm and your home cozy.
Step right up and you'll not find finer way anywhere else.
Keep your heart
Come
warm
one,
and
come
your
all.
home
Feast
cozy.
your eyes on our fine selection.
got to handle a month-old.
Kong Roar fik så den tanke, at han ville befale sine folk at bygge en hal at mødes i. Et mjødhus, der var større end mennesker.
If you go to Google Maps and you type in London, it'll take you probably right where you expect. But if you type in the city of London, it'll zoom into this much smaller area right here. London has a lot of unique neighborhoods, but this one is different. This is essentially a city within a city.
And if the King of England goes to the City of London, he can't enter unless he has the permission of the Lord Mayor. And that's been the case since William the Conqueror.
Even though the city of London has its own police force and mayor, you could walk through it without really realizing that it's separate from London at all.
If you do know what you're looking for, you can see that the street furniture changes. It goes to that red and white colour scheme. You have these dragon statues. They mark the edge of the jurisdiction of the City of London.
The reason for this separate city of London is rooted in the very founding of the city itself. And by looking at just a few elements of early London, we can really start to understand the layout of this city. If I make it the entire time here without getting hit by a car, it's probably a miracle. This is a place that's declared themselves the center of the world and was the capital of the largest empire in human history.
I recognise you from Instagram. I love your feed.
Oh, thank you. To try to understand this city, I went to London and met up with Jack Cheshire.
My colleagues will be very jealous.
In addition to running a blog and Instagram called Living London History, he also gives tours of the city and has recently released an awesome book all about the small little details that you might miss when you visit.
They generally talk about, the more, like the quirkier sites in London.
I was also introduced to Reg.
I'm
Daniel.
All right, yeah, Reg, yeah.
A man with great amounts of knowledge, energy, and strong British attitude.
The map for the international exhibition held in London in 1862.
He knows a ton about London, and he spent a while talking to me about it, but not before explaining to me that it was the British, not the French, that created the guillotine, apparently.
So there's the blade, and there's the person who's going to be beheaded. And that was in 1210, long before the French think they invented it. They invented it, yeah.
With how big it is and all of its history, London can be pretty overwhelming. But if we just zoom into the city of London, it's actually perfect because this was the city for most of its existence.
The City of London today is really the financial district.
Before we had the British Empire, London itself was a colony of a different empire, the Roman Empire.
And there have been a few sort of scattered Celtic tribes around the area, but no sort of proper urban settlement. So really the Romans founded London. But this is where the Romans established the city, as Londinium.
Much of the reason for London's placement and geography has to do with the natural landscape that was here originally. And you can see a lot of that in the streets still.
London is here because of the River Thames. Of course, that links us to the continent really and is an artery of trade and commerce and a link to the outside world. The reason that it's here specifically is probably because this is the first fordable point. So the Romans built the first bridge across the river.
About 100 years after deciding on the placement of this colony, the Romans built a wall around its perimeter that is still very influential on the city of London. Not only is this wall still evident in some of the street names, like the street London Wall, but there are portions of this wall that are still standing in the middle of modern-day London.
We're stood next to a section of the old Roman city wall. It had 5 gates in it initially, 7 gates in the medieval city. They added a couple.
And the names of these original gates are still names that are used in the city.
Obviously, it's a defensive measure, building a wall. No one necessarily knows who they were specifically trying to defend against. Celtic tribes and uprisings possibly coming into London. London being completely burnt to the ground in 61 AD by Boudicca. But also, as I say, you had those gates in the wall. Everyone had to come in through the gates. They could control who was coming in and out of the city. They could collect tolls from people. So, as is often the case with London, it comes down to money.
This wall became the border of the city for hundreds of years, even way long after the Roman Empire had fallen.
It really defined the shape of London for about 1,500 years.
And when you look a little closer at the natural landscape that the Romans were working with, it becomes really revealing about the layout of the modern city.
The history and geography of the city is all tied in together.
St. Paul's Cathedral, which is right here, is still one of the major anchor points in modern-day London. And you'll notice that it's within this Roman wall, and there's a reason for that.
The original Roman city was over 2 hills, Cornhill in the east, Ludgate Hill in the west here, and St. Paul's Cathedral, when it was originally built in the 7th century, was built on that second hill. On the other hill, on Cornhill, was where the Roman Forum and Basilica was. So you get these points in London that have always had some sort of significance, whether it's where a temple was, a church was, a cathedral was, but also a spot of power or a point relating to ceremony like the amphitheatre.
One of the major reasons the Romans decided to settle on the north side of the river is because the south side was super marshy and not very good for building on. So these 2 hills are a major reason that the city is right here. In addition to these 2 hills, there were also 2 rivers. One was the River Fleet, which was just west of the city, and the other was the Walbrook River, which ran between these 2 hills through the center of the city. And these are actually still visible, but you kind of have to look for them.
From the original Roman city, the original Roman gift shop. So we're coming down from St. Paul's Cathedral, which is built on Ludgate Hill, and we're walking down essentially into the river valley of the River Fleet.
Farringdon Street today is right here and follows the path of the River Fleet.
Farringdon Street and Farringdon Road is where the River Fleet once was. So you can see it starts to go up again on the other side. I mean, it's not very pronounced today because they built Ludgate Circus up and sort of levelled it off over the years, but you also still get these little clues. So just up behind me here, up the street, is a little road called Turn Again Lane, because you'd have once walked down that little street, you'd have come face to face with the River Fleet. There wasn't a crossing there, so you wouldn't have been able to get across, so you'd have had to have turned again and found another route. And it's still called Turn Again Lane today, even though the River Fleet, is no longer visible.
The wall is probably the biggest influence on the city today that the Romans made, but there are some other things. One of them is actually right here. And on the map, this is a visible remnant of an old Roman wharf called Queenhithe. The original Roman wharves were made of wood, and one of the original pieces of wood is actually outside of an entrance of a church that Jack and I go into in a bit. One of the most compelling things about this Roman Londinium is that it actually sat abandoned for nearly 400 years. For a bunch of reasons, the Roman Empire was contracting and the military was pulled out of this area and they just left the city behind. Okay, I owe you guys a massive, massive thank you. Not only for subscribing to this channel and getting it past 100,000 subscribers, which is so huge for me. Thank you. And if you're not subscribed, the button's right down there. You're welcome to subscribe. But what makes me so proud is that this is a community that's interested in understanding the world in more than just a surface level way. So I'm incredibly grateful for today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a tool I've been using that helps me understand the news and where it's coming from a lot better. They pull from over 50,000 sources and then provide you with tools to help you understand how different outlets cover different stories. One of the best ways you can support me and this channel is to use the link at the top of the description to sign up for Ground News, which is ground.news/support. Daniel Steiner. Every story comes with a visual breakdown of the bias distribution, factuality, and ownership of the reporting outlets, all backed by 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, this year, there's a painting from the 1500s that was found at a bus stop in London that is now going up for auction for over £25 million. When I came across this article, I could immediately see what was being reported from the left, the center, and the right. And with each of them, I could see who owns it, how factual it is, and what their bias is. If I click across these, I can see the different headlines, which often can vary a lot depending on the bias of the source. One of my favorite features of Ground News is their blind spot tool. What it does is shows you which articles and news reporting is not happening on the other side of the political spectrum. And they do this for roughly 20 stories every day. Go to ground.news/Daniel Steiner to get 40% off their Vantage plan, which is the plan that I use to get unlimited access to all of their features. Huge thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video, and thank you so much for watching this and for being a part of this community that wants to understand the world and understand each other a little bit better. Let's get back to the video about the map of London. After the Roman London, we start to enter the era of medieval London. There were Anglo-Saxons who, rather than occupying this same space that was already built, they built a new settlement just right next door. Modern-day Covent Garden was the heart of this Saxon settlement that was neighboring Londinium, and it became known as Londonwick,
which basically meant London Port or London Trading Town.
And this would become a key part of London today. To connect these two settlements, a main road was established that still exists today, actually as 2 roads. This portion here is the Strand, and this portion here is Fleet Street.
So for many years, the Strand really was the only road that linked up these 2 quite distinct places for most of London's history, and its name comes from the fact that it follows the bend of the Thames, the beach of the Thames, and it comes from the Old English word for beach, essentially. So all of these streets coming off the Strand down to the riverside, I mean, you can see they slope down. That's essentially the old riverbank of the Thames.
At the meeting point of these 2 streets is where Temple Bar Gateway is. Temple Bar is essentially a gate or a bar across the road that divided these 2 different settlements.
The column is where the Temple Bar Gateway once was and straddled the roadway there. So it pretty much marks the point where Fleet Street becomes the Strand, where the City of London becomes the City of Westminster.
While the Romans and Saxons did settle this land, it's not like they just walked in and plopped down. Invasions from Vikings led to these Anglo-Saxons reoccupying Londinium and building on and refortifying the then decaying Roman wall. It was a couple hundred years later when William the Conqueror invaded England and took charge.
He wanted to sort of intimidate the people of London, I suppose, and show them that someone new was in charge. So he had the White Tower in the Tower of London built, which is the keep in the centre with the 4 kind of onion domes on top there that you can see. So that's actually the oldest building in London, kind of complete building. Basically saying to the people of the City of London, I'm not going to interfere too much with what you're doing as long as you remain on my side. So he went around the rest of the country conquering it largely by military force. But when it came to the City of London specifically, he took on this slightly more diplomatic approach, I suppose, whether you can call it diplomatic, building a great big castle in the corner of the city, I don't know. But also, of course, it's right on the riverside as well, so he could then monitor ships coming into the city via the river, because it's downriver from London Bridge.
And speaking of London Bridge, it was during this time that it became much more than just a bridge. In 1987, David T. Agate, a passionate man armed with a lot of cardboard boxes, created a model of the medieval London Bridge that is still on display in a church right here. And Jack took me to see it.
You can see this amazing model of the old London Bridge, one of the wonders of the medieval world, here from the early 1200s until the early 1800s. And it was lined with buildings and shops on either side, sometimes up to 6 stories high, and then the roadway running between the 2. So it could get very, very congested, as you can see by all the little figures. You can see they used to display the heads of executed traitors, represented by these little matchsticks on the model. You couldn't really avoid body parts coming into the old City of London. It was built by the City of London, and they could charge people to live on there. There's still a foundation, I suppose, today that has loads of money, historic money, from the tolls paid and rent paid from the bridges, and they use that to build Tower Bridge, Southwark Bridge, Blackfriars Bridge is one of theirs as well.
In the 1830s, when the Industrial Revolution was just picking up steam, the population of London skyrocketed. And this led to a ton of congestion and need for new infrastructure. So this narrow bridge with its many arches became restrictive not only for people coming in and out of the city, but also for people going up and down the river. So it was dismantled, and a new bridge, just west of where that one was built in its place. The structure of London Bridge itself was replaced many times, but today this is still the London Bridge. When you look at how the roads line up, it's actually very clear where this bridge went. The church where this model is, Church of St. Magnus the Martyr, and its placement today seems kind of odd because it's kind of cut off from the city by these busy roads. But when you consider the old position of the bridge, it makes a lot more sense. The entryway of this church was actually the archway that entered the city onto Fish Street Hill on the north side.
We're on Fish Street Hill here, which was more or less the first road in Roman London. So it links down to London Bridge, down to the south here, over the river, and of course on to Dover and to the continent. And then up here it led to the Roman Forum, the Roman Basilica. So this was the axis of Roman London, if you like.
Do you remember who King Henry VIII is? He's the one that, killed his wives. Turns out his last name is not the Eighth, it's Tudor. And the period that followed the medieval period of London was called the Tudor period. This is when his family ruled England. The city really began to expand a lot more. During the medieval period, this area over here where Parliament is and Westminster is, was developing. There had long been a church there, Westminster Abbey, that had been kind of the political center of the city. But during King Henry VIII's reign, he really made significant changes to the Palace of Westminster and solidified this area as being the political center of not just London, but England. The city really began to expand west of the Roman center and south across the River Thames. It was at the very tail end of this era when a little thing called the British Empire came about. With London being in this spot on the river that could handle incoming ships, and with now a whole empire bringing things back from all over the world, the shipping industry and the docks really got built out in London. You can still see right here St. Catherine's Dock, which is just east of the Tower of London. One element of this was the creation of the East India Company, where a bunch of ships were going back and forth between England and India. And actually the word loot is a Hindi word that was used in the English language. Not only were they taking resources, but they were enslaving people and using London as a hub in the slave trade. This is a period of time that I can't really imagine anyone wanting to live in. The population was going up, the city was getting more dense, the slums were getting really bad and really extensive, the plague was going around and a lot of people were dying, and that all kind of led up to one day in 1666 when the city accidentally hit the reset button. Actually, it wasn't the city, it was one person, one guy, a baker.
In the early hours of the morning on the 2nd of September 1666, he hadn't put out his fire properly. A spark flew out of the fire, presumably landed in a pile of fuel, burnt down his property and spread.
Over the course of 3 or 4 days, 4/5 of the medieval city was destroyed by fire. This map shows where that fire was, and you can even see how the Roman wall helped kind of contain it in places. But all of the structures in this area were really damaged by the fire, and this included St. Paul's Cathedral. Shockingly, only 6 people died in the fire, which I was expecting a much bigger number. But I think the reason for this is because when the fire started, the Lord Mayor really underestimated how devastating it could be and was slow to take any action.
So incredibly destructive, but very much a turning point in some ways in London's history. It was the birth of London as a modern city in many ways. So all those old timber and thatch buildings were of course burnt to the ground. And after the fire, they brought various building regulations about what you could build your buildings out of. Stone, brick, you weren't allowed to have any overhanging floors, there were height restrictions, so they brought a little bit more order to the city as well.
Basically, immediately after, the next year, a monument was created to remember the fire, which was creatively called the Monument.
It symbolically depicts the Great Fire of London and then the rebuilding of the city. Maybe some bad timing. Great big rubbish truck. It's 202 feet high, which is roughly 61 metres. If you laid it down on its side, the top, the golden flaming urn at the top of the column, would land at the point that the Great Fire of London started. This little plaque in the middle of the road, this is where they've worked out that the Great Fire of London started.
It was built by this guy, Sir Christopher Wren, the most famous architect in England at the time. He had a lot of varied interests and wanted to try combining them.
There was like a laboratory in the bottom of the monument. They could open up hatches on the floors going up the column, and you could look up through the holes and it would act as a telescope, but they didn't realise that the column would move a little bit. So it didn't actually work out as a telescope, but it was originally meant to have a dual purpose, and the flaming urn at the top was meant to hinge off so that you could open it up. But for today you can climb up it.
But Christopher Wren had bigger plans than just a monument. He had drafted up an entire street layout proposal for the reconstruction of this area. You can see it has these wide, straight streets and plazas with this radial grid, just completely rewriting the vast majority of the roads. London doesn't look like this today because all of those who owned land were willing to stand by it, even though it was reduced to ash.
Londoners owned their little bit of freehold where their house used to be, now a burning pile of rubble, essentially, and they didn't want to give that up for this new plan.
The people who own the land in the city said, "What? That road goes through the middle of my land." So they kept all of those courts and alleys.
Are you glad that it stayed that way?
Yeah, absolutely. It's wonderful, the city. Yeah. It would have been horrible, it would have been like New York. I was going to say Paris, but Paris is quite nice. Only because they French people ruin it.
But even though his street plan was shot down, Sir Christopher Wren still went on to design the modern version we have of St. Paul's Cathedral. Even though the old street pattern was kept, there was one street that was added, and it was this one here. This makes up Queen and King Street.
Linking the Guildhall up this end, which is the sort of city hall of the City of London, right down to the river, where now Southwark Bridge is today.
This historic city had to undergo a pretty massive transformation from the medieval city that it was to the modern London that we know.
The population of Victorian London exploded, basically, in the 19th century. It went from about 1 million in 1800 to about 6 million in 1900. So, an astronomical growth over the course of that century. And that brought with it many problems, namely space and sewage and transport.
A lot of this was because of the demand for labor during the Industrial Revolution.
But also empire, of course, as well. The Victorian city was at the heart of the world's biggest, richest empire. It was the largest city in the world in the 19th century, so everyone was coming in for, ideally, I suppose, those opportunities, but it was a very unequal society.
Between the British Empire and the Industrial Revolution and all of these goods flowing into the city, something happened called canal mania. The idea of getting manic over building canals is just awesome. And many of these canals are still cemented in the fabric of the city. Like this one you can see cutting all the way across up here. As the city grew, so did the economic divide. The east side of the city became a growing slum with horrible conditions. And the west side was actually a lot of farmland that had long been owned by aristocrats. That was eventually turned into either parks, like Hyde Park, which is just off the map here, or subdivided and sold to other wealthy people who could own land. And that's why this area of the map, you start to get a more regular street pattern that resembles something closer to a grid. It was also during this time that the River Fleet, which used to run right here, was covered by Farringdon Road. This is not only because it was becoming really polluted, but also because the land that would take its place was becoming more and more valuable. The city also really began to expand south with the construction of a bunch of new bridges, making the London Bridge far from the only one. Most notable of these is Tower Bridge right here. To me, Tower Bridge is one of the symbols of London. Even though it was built centuries after the Tower of London, it not only took its name, but also its architectural style. In addition to the bridges going over the river, though, London was also the first place in the world to build a tunnel under the river. This was known as the Thames Tunnel and ran right here. Originally, it was just for pedestrians to cross under the river on foot, but the way that it was created actually paved the way for the tube system to be built, which today actually runs through the Thames Tunnel.
From the early 19th century, we had trains coming in, as in overground trains. But then we got, later on in the century, 1860s, we got the tube lines. So it was really that, and particularly when we could dig the deep level tube system, they could bore down into the ground. And that allowed London to spread rapidly.
It was also during this era when we got the creation of Trafalgar Square right here. It sits at the end of the Strand and became the center point for London, where all distances are measured from. This really was an era when new engineering feats were transforming the city, one of which was the building of embankments along the River Thames. A huge project to build 3 different embankments made the river a little bit narrower. One of them was just off the map here, another is Albert Embankment right here, and finally Victoria Embankment right here.
So we're still on the Victoria Embankment here, where in the 1860s they reclaimed about 35 acres of land from the river to put these lovely gardens on top, to put a road on top, but also to put a main sewer running through there and the district and circle line. So improving transport, space and sewage for a rapidly growing population. So behind me you've got the York Watergate, this is called, so it dates from 1626 and it used to be the Watergate, the sort of back entrance to York House, which was a huge mansion, an aristocratic mansion. That was knocked down in the 1670s, but it's Watergate was kept, and this hasn't moved, so this is exactly where it would have been before the embankments were constructed. Now the Watergate is sort of stranded in the middle of the gardens, but you can imagine the water still today of the Thames lapping up against the bottom of the steps here.
But all of this serious development and growth came under attack during World War II. For 8 months, spanning between 1940 and 1941, Nazis dropped thousands upon thousands of bombs on the city. This became known as the Blitz, short for the German word Blitzkrieg. Hitler's goal was to destabilize the British economy and to impede their efforts in the war.
The Nazis were targeting the heart of trade. They were trying to take out the power of London. So it was largely the city of London and the East End that took the brunt of the bombing in the Blitz.
Intense bombing led thousands to shelter in the tube tunnels underground. During this period, over 40,000 people were killed in the city. One night in December of 1940, the attack was so brutal that it became known as the Second Great Fire of London. These bombings resulted in fires that burned twice the size of land that the Great Fire of London did in 1666. One of the areas that took the most damage during this bombing was the area directly around St. Paul's Cathedral, and it's a miracle that the cathedral even survived at all.
So much effort went into saving St. Paul's during the Blitz. A team of volunteers, clergy, firefighters worked around the clock. They were called the St. Paul's Watch. They slept in the crypt of the cathedral. They were based up on the dome to keep an eye out for incendiary bombs, put out fires, and save St. Paul's Cathedral from the bombs of the Blitz.
Do you have any memories of reconstruction after the war?
I remember playing in the bombed out houses.
Wow.
We had the best adventure playground in the world.
You don't see many bomb sites around London anymore. Of course, generally they've been built over, restored. This one has been left. It's been left as a memorial garden to the Blitz. Blitz bombs destroyed the Victorian warehouses that were on this site, but revealed the old Roman wall beneath. So in some ways, a bit of a silver lining of the Blitz, that it revealed these layers of archaeology.
One place you can go see this is in the church All Hallows by the Tower.
It's actually, in terms of its foundation date, said to be the oldest church in the City of London, when London Wick was still a thing.
It was heavily damaged during the Blitz, and beneath it, a bunch of the artifacts are stored in a free museum.
So we're going down into the crypt here. So they've got a little crypt museum, so we need to go around here. These are bits of Saxon stonework here. The old church door, which has been damaged during the Blitz. This would have been the floor of a Roman dwelling that was here before, obviously way before the church was here.
But you don't necessarily have to go to a museum to see this stuff. Just walking around the city, you might come across some remnants. It's easy to think that all of this is history, that World War II was a long time ago, that now we've discovered everything about ancient Londinium, But the truth is, there's always more to the story. I think this is evident when you look at the archaeology that's been done even in the last 50 years in London.
So this is one of my favourite things down here. I mean, it's not an ancient artefact, but it's a model of Roman London. It was made in the 1920s, but it's missing one crucial part. It's missing the Roman amphitheatre, because they didn't know where that was by this point. That was only discovered during the rebuilding after the Blitz in the 1980s over by the Guildhall. So it should be in the top left corner up here.
And today there's a marking on the ground outside the Guildhall, so you can see where that amphitheater would have been. And this is just one example. The foundation of the original Shakespeare Globe was discovered just the year before, in 1989. In the 1960s and 1980s, it was discovered that these paintings were actually done on the back of the oldest map we have of London. Then, as recent as 2013, a mass burial ground was discovered from victims of the plague. And in 2016, 400 ancient writings from Roman London were discovered.
I think I've fallen more in love with London the more I've found out about it, if that makes sense. Like, the more you can tie together these stories or see that, you know, this is where a lost river used to be. It's almost a journey of the imagination, and it's a living place. It's not a museum, you know, it's not a perfectly preserved place, but that's what I think makes it so interesting and so fascinating.
Huge thank you to Reggie and Jack. Jack was incredibly helpful and spent a long time walking around with me. If you liked anything in this video, you're gonna love his book. So I've put the link in the description below, and you should pick yourself up a copy. If you wanna support me and this channel, don't forget to check out the link in the description for Ground News. You can hit that subscribe button if you haven't, and like this video. I also have a Patreon that's linked in the description. So if you're interested in supporting me there, I'll see you over there. But thank you so much for watching this, and I'll catch y'all in another video very soon. Peace.
Meet. Just give me a hammer and something needs to not move.
July the 27th, 1361, on the Isle of Gotland. Before the fortified walls of a great city, a militia awaits an invading enemy. They're all that lies between survival or destruction at the hands of a ruthless foe, professional soldiers and hired mercenaries. The worthy people are what made them fight and die together. More than 600 years later, an international group of archaeologists is attempting to find out more. They'll investigate some of the finds from the largest mass grave from a medieval battle ever found.
If you win or lose a battle, it's a momentous occasion for either the victors or the losers.
They'll try to shed light on the men who wore this armour and fought this battle.
Well, that's a foot that's been cut off.
That's incredible.
How they made their last stand and paid the ultimate sacrifice. The medieval world, the 5th to the 15th century. A team of archaeologists investigates medieval life by exploring the world of the medieval dead.
We have a classic view of the storybook medieval life. We don't hear the stories about the common man trying to keep his family alive.
In our stores, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of skeletons.
Archaeologically speaking, we can now focus in on the medieval dead people.
You're looking for clues in the skeleton all the time.
You couldn't help almost look through their eyes thinking, what did they see? How did they die?
Houses have been put to the torch. Grieving people stricken by the sword. Like a dog, he harries with a sword. And Gotland is conquered by the Danes. The words of inscriptions found hidden in churches and monasteries of Gotland from 1361. Bitter words by a beaten people. The Swedish Isle of Gotland in the Baltic Sea has been free of war for 200 years. Yet in the centuries before, its history was anything but bloodless. In the Middle Ages, Gotland was the richest city in the Baltic. It was a hub for seafaring trade and commerce dating back to Viking times. There are more hoards of coins and treasure found here than anywhere else. The middle years of the 1300s were a golden age for Gotland, most of all for its glittering capital, Visby. No wonder then that this rich island drew envious eyes from across the Baltic. 1361 proved a pivotal year for Visby and the Gotlanders.
As archaeologists, we're really interested in these periods of transition, and there's nothing that displays one of these transitions better than a battle or a conflict, because usually there is an outcome that's very decisive, and that period of transition is not large scale. It can be down to hours, minutes, days, or whatever, but it's certainly not years. And if you find a mass grave of the people who were killed during that conflict, that's perfect, because that is the moment when the transition took place. So you can find out what happened before, what happened afterwards, and this is the point where it took off. And this is just a list on this island. Because it's an island, it's a very small, insular sort of activity, but it has repercussions across the whole of the Baltic, basically.
The events of 1361 in Gotland captivate medieval historians and archaeologists. The story comes to us from different sources. Few Gotlanders were left alive to tell the tale. King Valdemar IV of Denmark invaded the island with a large army of Danish and German mercenary troops. The Gotlanders, without a standing army, formed a militia to try and stop them, but they were pushed back to Visby. It was not an even contest, yet the militia stood their ground. The Gotlanders were annihilated by the professional Danish and German soldiers. The island was stripped of its riches and never again flourished as it had done in past centuries. It was the end of the Golden Age. The story might have remained nearly forgotten in the history books, were it not for a chance discovery more than 5.5 centuries later. In 1905, a large grave was discovered outside the old town of Visby, traditionally the site of the Gotlanders' last stand, commemorated by a great stone cross. In the grave were hundreds of skeletons. In 1928, 3 more pits were found, with hundreds more. The Visby mass graves were a worldwide sensation, among the most important finds ever made in medieval archaeology. The finds were extraordinary, more than 1,100 complete skeletons.
I think Visby, you could quite easily say it's unique. It's an assemblage of human remains that were discovered in the early 20th century of people that died during battle. It's mind-blowing really in terms of the evidence you can acquire from a grave such as that. I can't think of another example where people were buried in their armour. Finding the people that died in battle in mass graves with their arms and armour is phenomenally rare. In fact, it's virtually unique. When I first came across this assemblage and I first heard about the Battle of Visby, I thought, man, obviously it's just another battlefield mass grave. And so when I first saw the information that was compiled in the early 20th century, and there were plates of armour on the skeleton itself, and you think, this is unbelievable. It's so unusual, and the mind races to try to work out so many questions. Why were they buried like this? What sort of armour was it? How effective was it? What were the people like? But as an assemblage, it's so important, and it really makes your mind race, and it builds up a picture of what presumably happened on that day.
The events of 1361 caused a deep scar that took generations to heal. Even now, it casts a shadow down the centuries. This is why historians and researchers, today more than 80 years after the last excavations, are compelled to revisit the story. Tim Sutherland has come to Gotland to add what he can to the ongoing research into the events of 1361. He's a specialist in medieval archaeology, particularly battlefield archaeology. In 1996, he excavated the mass grave from the medieval Battle of Towton in northern England. Now he's hoping to put that experience to use here. The grave site is a few hundred meters from the walls of Visby. The battlefield itself has long since been destroyed by modern development. But it's likely this area was chosen as a burial place because there was a monastery here at the time of the battle, and it would have been close enough to drag or carry large numbers of dead. He'll carry out a survey of the site where the mass graves were excavated to establish exactly where the pits were. They haven't been touched since they were backfilled after the original excavation.
The good thing about this area is it contains a monument, not only the medieval monument of the stone cross, but we've got a modern monument of the wooden cross which stands in the centre of the church. The graves are under the pavement, they're under the road, they're under the grass, they're even under this garden and the house next to it. And so the interesting thing is, how much of any part of this can you see?
We've already got the grid laid out. I'm just going to extend it by 1 metre, maybe 2 metres, run some lines just up there, and then we can just get going.
Working with Tim is Dr. Helen Goodchild of the University of York. She's a specialist in remote sensing, including ground-penetrating radar. The radar may be able to show the graves, although there's no way of knowing just how much the site has been disturbed over the past 80 years.
We can survey through the pavement and hopefully get evidence of the mass graves. Then we want to just move slowly across the grass, getting more data as we move towards the cross. Hopefully we'll see evidence of at least 1 or 2 of these graves. But that's the challenge here. Can we see any evidence of the archaeological remains that exist here from the Battle of Visby?
Back in 1928, Swedish archaeologist Bengt Tordeman began his own survey by looking for the area that had been excavated in 1905. He not only found this, but also 3 more mass graves. The dig had to expand to an unprecedented scale to recover all the material. Yet after almost a year, there was still one entire grave left unexcavated. This grave, grave 4, is believed to be at the edge of the site, still down there, untouched.
The reason they stopped excavating is that they just had too many bodies. They had 3 existing graves which were all full, some of which had chainmail, coifs, gauntlets, shirts, and there were even some plate armour in there as well. And so by the time they'd excavated 1, 2, 3 graves, they came across grave 4 and they thought, there's no need to excavate this. So luckily for us, we left this in place.
What seemed as though it would be a straightforward survey hasn't been as easy as they thought. All under the field are the buried ruins of the old monastery.
It started out quite traumatic in that there are big thorn bushes in the way. There are lots and lots of undulations in the ground. We thought it was a very flat, green grass, and it's covered in lumps, bumps, and also stone walls. So the radar was bouncing all over them. So, although it was very hard work, and we've only covered a relatively small area, the results seem to be really good.
The experience has left him with a strong respect for the archaeologists who surveyed this site more than 80 years ago.
You can't help but admire the people in the past because they had very basic equipment, theodolites, techniques, and a spade and a trowel, and yet they came up with so much quality data, and we should look back at these people with reverence and say, actually, they were very, very good at what they did. And we can learn a lot from them because they accumulated very good data, but at a very basic level. And we now follow in their footsteps and say, can we improve on what they've done? Sometimes it's quite difficult, actually, because it's just such good work that they've done.
They plot the results and see if any of the archaeology can be seen.
So although this is still grass and house and garden, we can see what they found. So we can use this to interpret our data.
As Tim had feared, there's a lot of modern interference.
The problem is we've got several hundred years of archaeology, including very, very modern features.
When they strip this away, they can see the medieval archaeology.
So we've got where the graves were, where the railings were, where the cross still is, and all the water pipes and anything else they encountered. So So anything that's shaded there is where they've excavated. Now, although this is still grass and house and gardens, we can see what they found.
The empty pits, left after Toordeman excavated them, show up clearly.
Grave 1, right in the road. Grave 2, half in the road. Grave 3, almost under part of the railing.
And they've successfully verified Grave 4, completely unexcavated, under the pavement.
And then Grave 4, this is the one that was never fully excavated. It still exists in its primary form about a metre below the street.
Then Tim sees something else they weren't expecting.
So we've got this strange anomaly there, which you would think may be something like a pit. The good news is,
it doesn't look like modern interference. Could it be from 1361?
that's interesting. That looks more archaeological. It looks like an archaeological pit.
Grave 4 alone might contain many more skeletons and armour. And now Tim and Helen's survey has found another possible grave to be investigated. Future excavations will benefit from Tim and Helen's work. On July the 22nd, 1361, Valdemar's invasion force landed some 15 miles to the south of Visby, at Vastegan, where the bay forms a natural harbour. Then they headed north. The Gotland militia fought at least one battle to try and head off the invaders, but they were beaten back. The militia fell back to the only fortified town on the island, Visby. Yet the great gates were closed to them. The Visbians would not allow them inside the city wall. Despite their protests, they were left to take their chances and face the invaders, their backs to the wall. The scene was set for their brave, but ill-fated, last stand at Visby. The Visby defences were strong enough to hold out. Why did they not let the Gotlanders in? The ring wall is a symbol of the city. Today it's protected, as Visby is a World Heritage Site. But in 1361, for the militia outside the gates, the ring wall meant the difference between life and death.
Gotland was in the middle of the Baltic, which made it very rich, because you can trade from the east to the west and from the west to the east. And the Gotlandic people were good traders.
Visby was one of the trading hotspots of the Baltic, with waterfront warehouses, whitewashed buildings, and a safe harbour.
It was a stone town, the medieval Manhattan, with high white buildings. You had lots of churches inside the Visby. This ring wall must just be astonishing to come to Visby.
These were prosperous times. People of many different nationalities came here, drawn by a city built for trading.
Visby was very cosmopolitan, and it was an international town with many different people here. The Germans, Englishmen, and the Gotlanders trading side by side in the town.
So when the invasion came, why didn't they open up to the Gotlanders?
We think that the Gotlandic people wanted to use Visby decided to negotiate instead. That's why they don't open the gates to let the Gotlandic people in. Maybe they were afraid to army into their town. So then they left the guy just outside the wall.
The Great Ring Wall was not just built for defence against overseas invaders. There was tension between the Gotlandic farmers and the Visby officials who controlled trade on the island.
The wall was built to get the farmers to pay to get into the trading in Visby. Because the people in Visby were the for themselves on their own.
A city wall to force the indigenous farmers to pay to enter and sell their goods at market. Such was the schism that existed between the islanders and the Visbian merchants.
Yes, sire!
They must have known the grid.
Yes, sire! Yes, sire! Everybody forward! My lead! Attack!
Still wanted to
In late spring 1361, the Gotlanders received orders of an invasion of England. They had just weeks to raise the militia, to train, and to armour up. The Danish army inflicted a terrible defeat on the Gotlanders, yet little is known about exactly what happened during the final battle. Yet thanks to the excavations, there is physical evidence for what happened. Visby is unique in archaeology because many of the Gotlanders went to the grave still wearing the armour that they'd fought and died in. It's this armour that Karen Watts of Britain's Royal Armouries has come to see. It's here in Stockholm that most of the armour is stored. Karen has spent her entire career studying European arms and armour. And again, as with Tim, Visby is one of the reasons she became passionate about the subject.
It's the best armour I've ever seen.
The most iconic items among the Visby collection are the body armours. Any kind of armour from this time in the Middle Ages is extremely rare. Here, though, there's a whole range of armours, all worn in battle together, then buried at the same time. It's an unparalleled insight into how medieval soldiers faced
Anywhere in the world, ever.
The types of armours are known as coat of plates and lamella. They're made up of individually forged pieces of iron, riveted or wired together as part of a leather or textile harness. With several complete armours together, it's possible for Karen to see how each was tailored to suit individual competence.
I can't believe the size. Look, it's for a boy. These actually, I have never realised that they're different sizes.
Thomas Neyman is a serving Swedish army officer. He studied all the 1361 armours, painstakingly reconstructed here after they were recovered from the mass graves. Tordeman identified a number of types at different stages of development.
Is it 4 different types of armors?
Yeah.
So you can see it evolving in this different material
Absolutely.
from these pits. If you look up here, what we see here is different layers of textile that's been metallized. So now it's metal. And what I counted to so far is 3 layers. But it could be more, but we have to do more research.
The most common armours are the coat of plates type, a kind of medieval flak jacket.
all of these arms are purely functional. They are fighting military equipment with no adornment or ornamentation. Except for this one, because this one has got brass plaques. It's there as a purely an example of heraldic display. And have you identified them in the ceilings?
That's one of the interesting things. It's a lot of theories. One of the theories is that it's the family down in London. But we actually don't know. So it could be because it's one person missing.
Some of the skeletons had the remains of male armour still on them, such as these hoods or coifs. It's rare enough to find single male links from most medieval battle sites, so entire shirts and coifs like these are extremely unusual. One of the key mysteries surrounding the burials is why so much armour was left on the bodies and not first stripped. Various explanations have been put forward, such as the hot weather at the time of the battle, the risk of disease, or just that there were too many bodies to bury and too few left alive to do the job.
In the first mass grave, you can see how they've been neatly buried side by side, but in the end they're just thrown into the pit with everything, and you even find coins and knives and quite valuable items as well. So they have been in a hurry for their last days. It must have been a horrible experience to get all those bodies into the pits.
Why on earth would you bury these people with all this very, very expensive equipment with them? And there are all sorts of potential answers. One of the answers is that basically there was no time to strip, which is a bit vague, down to the extreme possibility that you couldn't actually get the armour off them. If it was the heat of the day, all the bodies have been left for a few days in an intense heat, and they all start bloating, you wouldn't be able to get the chain mail off them. It's as simple as that. So you would probably have to start butchering the bodies to get the mail off them and the armour. In which case, are they prepared to do this? The bodies are hot, stinking, festered, and of course, it's not that valuable when you bury it. The good news about burying somebody in their armour in a place that's marked by a large cross is that you can come back in 5 years, 1 year, or whatever, and come and take them off skeletons rather than off fleshed bodies. And so that's the one thing that makes more sense, is that they were going to come back for these bodies, and they never did.
Metal was an expensive commodity. But what if the armour was obsolete? Could that be why they left it and didn't come back?
An armour was very valuable, so we think that they put the armours in the mass graves because if it was hot, you had to get rid of it quite fast, but also the equipment was old. Some of the armours, the plate armours, are still modern at this time, but some of them are more Viking style, then it's really old.
Another reason might be that access to the burials may have been restricted by the conquerors.
This also suggests that they weren't possibly not allowed. They weren't allowed to strip it, and it was only the victors that were allowed access to all this. Now, if they had enough equipment and they didn't particularly want to bother themselves by stripping on the dead, they might not have allowed anybody else to do it. Remember, this is armour, and there are weapons, and so it could be that they wanted to hide their armour anyway to stop the Gotlanders getting access to it. So what better way than burying it? And it's a way of getting rid of a potential problem in the future.
The coat of plates and lamellar armours were transitional systems. By 1361, these were being superseded by more sophisticated full plate armour for most professional men-at-arms, like the Danish and German mercenaries the Gotlanders were up against.
As everybody thinks these things are amazingly archaic and old-fashioned, if they're leading towards what is going to be a solid breastplate, and people are having to wear body protection, need something that is flexible, something that you can run in, something that you can move in, but a rigid body protection is an advantage over mail. Mail is flexible, it's very good, it protects you against sword cuts, but it doesn't protect you from heavy percussive blows if you're hit with a heavy blunt instrument. They know that mail is good because it's very flexible, but they want light. And they spend years trying to evolve that. This is a massive technological improvement when you can shape large planks.
The Visby collection is very important. It's almost the missing link in the evolution of European medieval armour.
In terms of technology, in terms of whoever designed this one is on the right track. This is the one that is going to evolve into the final armour. All of these are showing invention, are showing the desire to find the perfect armour.
The well-equipped Danish men-at-arms and professional German mercenaries of Valdemar's army probably took anything of value left over after the battle, especially items that were easily removed, like helmets, of which none has ever been found at Visby.
So weapons and helmets are taken care of. And they are quite easy to take off. And you can also reuse the material. The iron itself is good even if the helmet is old or damaged. I think it was old and it was messy, sitting to those skulls that were smashed into pieces.
But what of the remains of the Gotlanders themselves? What evidence still lies in their bones? Malin Holst is an osteoarchaeologist, a specialist in skeletal remains. She's come to Stockholm to see for herself a selection of some of the bones from Visby. She wants to find out more about the collection, how the bones were classified and conserved.
I don't normally approach the medieval period as a touchy-feely romantic thing. I just try to be scientific about it and try to see what's there and take what's there as fact and then interpret from there. When I do analyze medieval skeletons, I do see their daily lives from their bones and also from the context they were found in. And in the medieval period, you don't normally have grave goods, but you might see markers on their bones that suggest certain activities or fractures of certain bones or particular wear on the teeth that give a clue about their daily lives.
Malin's osteological work has involved in-depth study of the only other mass grave from a medieval battlefield, at Pt.10, with around 100 skeletons. Here in the stores at Stockholm's Historical Museum, there are more than 10 times the number of skeletons recovered from Pt.10.
We visually analyze the skeleton, so we determine the age, the sex, the living height, and any diseases the person suffered from or any injuries they suffered from. It's usually not possible to tell the cause of death. Osteoarchaeology works very much together with archaeology, and it's very, very important for us to work together and communicate with each other, because if I just study a skeleton, it only tells me a limited amount of information. But if I then put it into the archaeological context and see what the grave was like, what the site was like, what the general areas like that the individual came from, then I understand much, much more about the individual.
The excavations were very meticulous for the time to take care of all the skeletons, because they had a great interest in the military history, and all the cuts on the bones were very interesting to them. Right. But we have another interest in the bones because we want to learn more about the people.
Yeah.
Archaeology was a relatively new science. Peter Ackerson has studied the skeletons for much of his professional life, probably more than anyone else. He's looked at the ways in which techniques of analysis in the 1930s differed from current 21st century osteology. Due to the sheer amount of material, little work has been done on them since they were excavated, the best part of a century ago. Since then, methods and attitudes, not to mention technology, have changed.
But this is also an example of how the skeletons have become mixed. Yeah. So this is a box with femur and tibia and one femur.
The bones were not kept together in their individual skeletons. Archaeological methods were different in Tordeman's time. The site was gridded and excavated strictly square by square.
You have to work bones from one skeleton, they mark them so they can see skeleton.
Today, the accepted method is to excavate each individual skeleton completely, one at a time, keeping all the bones together in context. what isn't of use to contemporary means of analysis might still be useful in the future if the whole skeleton is stored together.
In some cases, we have all the thigh bones in boxes in one box and the other bones in other boxes. So our work was a bit tedious trying to figure out which pieces belong to which skeleton.
The sheer number of skeletons makes it very time-consuming to conserve them. Petter and other osteologists have spent many hours placing back together the Visby skeletons. Some haven't been looked at since they were packed away for storage. Yet it gives a unique cross-section of the types of wounds sustained in a medieval battle. Almost every skeleton has some evidence of trauma. Tordemann's analysis was the first step towards revealing more about the individuals in the mass graves. His work paved the way for modern osteology. The evidence is in the bones.
To be able to give them something back, hopefully you could never be able to give them their name back, but what you could say is, right, this person was of a certain height, of a certain stature, of a certain robusticity, and they look like they did some honest, hard grafting, and they suffered in life like they had a broken limb or a broken finger. You can see all this on the skeletal remains.
All these skeletons that now remain of these people, they need to tell their stories, and I'm trying to be their voice.
To be able to see them through their eyes and say, right, fair enough, this is how they lived their life, until eventually one day they died, for whatever reason, whether it was young or old, whether it was alone or whether it was with family and friends. You could have died in a battle, and you would have been tossed into a mass grave with very large amounts of people, and completely unknown. To be able to see their life almost through their eyes becomes very important. Because I've been told by soldiers serving today that one of their dreads is to die anonymously, unknown, and then be buried with nobody knowing where they are, who they were, and what it's all about, how they died. And so, to a certain degree, archaeologists can help an individual from a long time ago have some sort of saying, in the future. This is who I was, this is what I did, this is how I lived my life, and potentially this is how I died.
It's always difficult to say in a battle situation where do the injuries hit the body. I mean, it's in the turmoil of the battle you can get a blow from any part, from any distance, and you don't really know. They had no chance because the invaders were so much better at fighting and more experienced.